The morning Amelia Rose Carter was sold, her aunt didn't even look her in the eye. Margaret Holloway sat at the head of the breakfast table, stirring her coffee with slow, deliberate circles, as if the conversation she was about to have was no different from discussing feed prices or the weather. Amelia stood in the doorway, still holding the dish towel she'd been using when her cousin had come to fetch her, and she noticed, the way you notice small, wrong things before the large, terrible thing arrives, that the good china was out. The set her mother had brought from Pennsylvania, the one Margaret never used unless she wanted something. "Sit down, Amelia." There were two men at the table she didn't recognize. Both wore the kind of clothes that cost more than her father had earned in a year. One of them looked at her the way a buyer looks at livestock, not unkind exactly, but measuring, calculating, already deciding. "We've made arrangements," Margaret said, still not meeting her eyes. "For the debt, for the house, for everything." Amelia's hand tightened on the towel. If you're watching this story and wondering how a person survives the moment they realize they are being traded, stay with me. Because what happens next changed everything. Before we go further, if this story already has your heart beating faster, please hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you don't want to miss what comes next, because what happens at that ranch will shake you to your core, subscribe and follow along. Every episode gets harder to put down. Now let's go back to that table and to the woman nobody thought would survive it. Beck. Silver Hollow, Montana, in the autumn of 1882, was not a place that forgave softness. The wind came down from the mountains with a kind of personal cruelty, and the town itself seemed to have absorbed that same quality over the decades, sharp-edged, suspicious of anything it hadn't already decided the value of. It was a town that labeled people early and labeled them permanently, and Amelia Rose Carter had been labeled before she was old enough to understand what the label meant. She had been called heavy. She had been called slow, though she wasn't. She had been called plain, though that wasn't accurate either. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and there was something in her face when she was thinking hard that a more observant person might have called striking. But Silver Hollow wasn't an observant town. It decided things and moved on, and it had decided about Amelia when she was 12 years old, and her dresses had started to be let out at the seams, and no one had ever revisited that decision since. Her father, Robert Carter, had been the one person in the world who looked at her without calculation. He'd been a quiet man, a decent man, a man who kept his word even when keeping it cost him. And it had cost him, in the end, more than he had. He'd borrowed against the land to get through 2 bad winters, and then a 3rd bad winter had come. And he hadn't told Amelia how bad things were because he didn't want her to worry, and then in March he had sat down in his chair after supper and simply didn't get up again. The doctor said it was his heart. Amelia thought it was everything. She had spent the 6 months after his death trying to hold the pieces together, managing what was left of the house, taking in mending work, selling eggs when the hens cooperated, trying not to think about the number her father's accountant had shown her in that small, airless office that smelled of tobacco and regret. She had been doing an almost reasonable job of surviving, which was why it caught her so completely off guard when Margaret arrived from Butte with her silk dress and her good shoes and her 2 strange men with their expensive coats. Margaret Holloway was her mother's sister. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. In those 11 years, Margaret had sent 4 letters and attended 1 funeral, and Amelia had understood without being told that she was not part of Margaret's life in any meaningful way. So when her cousin showed up at the kitchen door, Margaret's oldest boy, Gerald, 19 and already wearing his mother's expression, Amelia had felt the first cold thread of unease move through her. "Mother wants to see you," Gerald said. He didn't say good morning. She walked into the dining room and found the china out and the strange men seated, and Margaret stirring coffee with the particular composure of someone who had already won an argument that the other person didn't know they were having. "Sit down, Amelia." She sat. The dish towel was still in her hands. She set it on her lap and straightened her back the way her father had taught her. "You don't have to feel tall to sit tall." And she looked at her aunt and waited. "These gentlemen represent the interests of Mr. Jackson Whitaker," Margaret said, "of the Whitaker Ranch. I expect you've heard the name." Everyone in 4 counties had heard the name. Jackson Whitaker owned more land than some small nations. He'd built the largest cattle operation in the Montana Territory from what people said was almost nothing, starting with a string of horses and a reputation for being harder to frighten than any man had a right to be. He was 38 years old and had been a widower for 5 years, and in those 5 years he had shown exactly zero interest in acquiring another wife, which had not stopped the unmarried women of the region from angling hopefully in his direction whenever he came to town. "I've heard of him," Amelia said carefully. "Then you know what it means that he's looking to remarry." Margaret finally looked at her. Her eyes were not cruel exactly. They were the eyes of someone who had made a business calculation and was satisfied with the arithmetic. He needs a wife who can manage a household, someone steady, someone who won't cause drama. One of the men, the taller one, who had the look of a lawyer, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker has specific requirements. He's a practical man. He's not looking for," a small pause, barely perceptible, "ornamentation." Amelia understood what that pause meant. She had been understanding pauses like that her whole life. "What he needs," Margaret said, smoothing it over in the way she smoothed everything, "is someone reliable. And you, Amelia, need the debt settled. The house will go to auction in 60 days if the bank note isn't paid. We all know that." She said we all know that in a tone that made it clear she viewed this as Amelia's failure, not as a natural consequence of 2 catastrophic winters and a father whose heart gave out. "Mr. Whitaker is prepared to settle the Carter debt in full, in exchange for a proper wife." The room was quiet except for the sound of Margaret's spoon against the china. Clink, clink, clink. Amelia looked at the 2 men. The lawyer had his hands folded on the table. The other one, younger, probably an assistant of some kind, was studying the wall behind her head with tremendous concentration. "Does Mr. Whitaker know anything about me?" Amelia asked. "He's been informed of the relevant details," the lawyer said. "That's not what I asked." A flicker of something crossed the lawyer's face. Surprise, maybe. He hadn't expected her to push back. None of them had, she could tell. They'd come in here with their expensive coats and their settled matter expressions, and they'd expected her to fold immediately, the way poor girls in debt were supposed to fold when a rich man offered a lifeline. "He knows you're 24, the lawyer said. "He knows your father recently passed. He knows you're capable and have managed a household without assistance." "Does he know what I look like?" The silence this time was different, heavier. Margaret set down her spoon. "Amelia, I'm asking a direct question." She kept her voice even. Her father had taught her that too. The person who raises their voice first has already lost something. "Because if I'm going to be married to a man I've never met, I'd like to know whether he's going to look at me on our wedding day and feel deceived. I'd like to know that up front." The lawyer looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the table. And in that exchange, that small, cowardly deflection, Amelia got her answer. He didn't know. Or if he'd been told, it had been told with the kind of softening language that amounted to not telling. Sturdy, handsome in her own way, a practical-looking woman. She stood up. The dish towel fell to the floor and she left it there. "I need to think," she said. "Amelia?" Margaret's voice had an edge now. "The decision is essentially, I need," Amelia said, turning in the doorway to look at her aunt with the full force of the only thing she'd inherited cleanly from her father, which was the ability to be absolutely immovable when she chose 1 hour. She walked out the back door and stood in the yard where she'd hung laundry every week for the past 6 months, and looked at the mountains and thought about her father, and thought about the bank, and thought about 60 days, and thought about a man she'd never met who apparently needed a wife, and had been told she was practical looking. The mountains didn't offer anything useful. They rarely did. After 40 minutes, she went back inside. "All right," she said to Margaret and the 2 men in their expensive coats, "but I have conditions." She watched the lawyer's eyebrows rise slightly. She'd surprised him again. Good, she thought. Get used to it. Her conditions were 3. First, she would have a private letter sent to Mr. Whitaker, written by her, delivered by his men, that described herself plainly and honestly, without the softening language that seemed to have been employed so far. If he withdrew the offer after reading it, she would consider the matter closed and find another way to handle the debt. Second, if he chose to proceed, she would need 30 days at the ranch before any formal ceremony to determine whether the arrangement was livable for both parties. Third, and this was the one that made Margaret suck in a sharp breath, she would not be treated as property. She would manage the household as a partner in the enterprise, not as decoration or as staff. "Those are interesting terms," the lawyer said slowly. "Take them or leave them." He took them. She spent the rest of that afternoon at the kitchen table writing the most honest letter she'd ever put on paper. She described her height and her weight without euphemism. She described her face accurately. She described her skills. She could keep accounts. She could manage workers. She could stretch $1 further than anyone had a right to expect. She could read faster than most men she'd met and retain what she read. She could make decisions under pressure, and she wasn't afraid of hard weather. She also, at the very end, wrote one sentence that she almost crossed out 4 times before she let it stay. "I am not the wife you may have pictured, but I am not nothing, and I think it is important that you know the difference before you decide." She sealed the letter herself and gave it to the lawyer personally, watching his face as he took it. "Make sure he reads it before he sends any response," she said. Of course. She didn't believe him, but she'd done what she could do. 3 days later, the response came back. The terms were accepted. All 3 of them. She read the response twice, looking for the catch. There wasn't one. Or if there was, it was hidden well enough that she couldn't find it from a single letter written in a steady, unremarkable hand. The response was short. It said, "Your terms are fair. I'll expect you in 2 weeks. Bring what you need. The ranch has the rest." And then, below the signature, "I read your letter myself." She didn't know what to make of that last line. She read it standing at the kitchen window in the early morning light, the house quiet around her, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a small, cautious version of curiosity. She'd spent 3 days bracing for rejection. She'd prepared herself for the particular humiliation of a man deciding, sight unseen, based on her honest description, that he'd rather solve his problem some other way. She'd had the whole conversation in her head, the way she could be dignified about it, the way she would figure out the debt on her own. She hadn't prepared for "I read your letter myself." She folded the response and put it in her coat pocket and went back to packing. Margaret watched her pack with the expression of someone who had expected gratitude and was still waiting for it to appear. She hovered in doorways and made small comments about what Amelia should and shouldn't bring, about how she ought to behave at the ranch, about the importance of not embarrassing the family. Amelia listened to approximately 15% of this and nodded at appropriate intervals and kept packing. On the morning she left, Margaret stood on the porch in her good dress and said, "You should be grateful, you know. Not many men would take on a woman in your situation." Amelia had her bag in her hand and the ranch wagon waiting at the end of the lane. She looked at her aunt, this woman who had come in her silk and her calculations and arranged the terms of another person's life without once asking what that person wanted. And she felt something shift in her chest. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than anger, but harder. "Thank you for the house, Margaret," she said, "while I was in it." She walked to the wagon and didn't look back. The drive to the Whittaker Ranch took the better part of a day. The man driving, one of Jackson's ranch hands, a weathered older fellow named Pete, who had introduced himself with exactly those words and then said nothing further for 6 hours, navigated the wagon along roads that got rougher and wider as they went, the mountains getting closer and the sky getting larger and the empty land spreading out in a way that was either frightening or liberating depending on how you looked at it. Amelia chose to look at it as liberating. She needed something to work with. By the time the ranch came into view, the light was going golden and long across the grass, and the main house sat at the end of a long approach road that was lined improbably with young cottonwood trees that someone had planted deliberately, with intention, as if they understood that the entrance to a place told you something about the people inside it. The house itself was large, much larger than she'd imagined, and it had the look of something that had been built in stages, added to as money came, with a practical core of logs and stone, and then wings extending outward as if the building itself had been trying to accommodate more life than it started with. She was not overwhelmed by it. She was alert to it, which was different. She was cataloging, the way she always cataloged new information, filing it away in the part of her mind that her father had called her ledger. "You've got a ledger up there, Amelia girl, and it misses nothing." Pete pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and stopped and sat there. "Is someone going to come out?" Amelia asked. "He'll be out," Pete said. She waited. A full minute passed. 2. She began to wonder if this was some kind of test, and then she decided it didn't matter whether it was or wasn't. She would simply wait, because she had nowhere else to go and because she had learned that anxiety about waiting rarely shortened the wait. Then the front door opened. Jackson Whittaker was not what she'd expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. The stories painted him in a particular way, large, imposing, the physical embodiment of everything the frontier rewarded, and some of that was accurate. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the kind of economy that came not from grace, but from years of knowing exactly how much energy every action required and not spending a drop more. His face was weathered and his jaw was heavy, and there was a scar above his left eye that cut through the eyebrow in a way that suggested whoever had given it to him had not found the experience pleasant either. But what she noticed first before any of that was that he looked tired, not sleepy. Tired in the way that went deeper. The kind of tired that meant something had been wearing at a person for a long time, and they'd gotten good at carrying it but hadn't stopped feeling the weight. She recognized it because she'd seen it in her father in the last 2 years of his life, and she'd seen it in the mirror on certain mornings. He came down the porch steps and stopped at a distance that was respectful without being cold, and looked at her. Not the measuring look she'd gotten from the lawyer. Something more direct than that, more honest. He was taking her in, yes, but he wasn't calculating. He was simply looking. The way you look at someone when you're trying to understand something about them that can't be explained in a letter. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Whittaker." A moment of silence, the kind that wanted to mean something. "Pete giving you trouble on the road?" he asked. "Pete gave me exactly no trouble," she said. "He barely gave me words." Something moved across Jackson Whittaker's face. It took her a second to identify it because it was so brief and because it didn't look like what she was used to. It looked like the beginning of a real thing, not a polite thing. Amusement, she thought. Actual amusement, caught and then tucked away. "That's Pete," he said. "I didn't mind," she said. "I had a lot to think about." He nodded once as if that answer had confirmed something. Then he reached out a hand, not to escort her, just an open hand, a here gesture, toward the house. "Come on then," he said. "Supper's probably cold, but Mrs. Aldridge will reheat it." She picked up her bag before he could reach for it. He noticed. He didn't comment. She walked into the house with her back straight and her bag in her hand and the folded letter in her coat pocket, and the certain knowledge that the next 30 days would determine everything about what the rest of her life looked like. She was frightened, she would admit that to herself. She was frightened in the way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with being a person who understood clearly what was at stake. But she was also, and this surprised her, still curious. That curiosity, she thought, climbing the porch steps behind the man who was possibly her future, might be the most honest thing she'd brought with her. The house smelled like wood smoke and something roasting. The hallway was wider than the hallway of any house she'd ever been in, lined with pegs for coats and hats, with muddy boots lined up near the door in a way that suggested habit and order rather than someone tidying up for company. This was a place people actually lived in, she thought. That was good. She followed Jackson Whittaker through the hallway toward the sound of a kitchen, and she noticed, her ledger noticing, always noticing, that he walked ahead of her but turned once to check that she was following, and that when he did, his expression was not the expression of a man showing off his house or performing generosity. It was the expression of a man who was nervous, which was the last thing she'd expected. She filed that away too. At the kitchen door, he stopped and said, without turning around, "I should tell you, I did read your letter, all of it." "I know," she said. "You said. I wanted you to know I meant it." He seemed to be choosing his next words with unusual care for a man who had the reputation of someone who shot first and thought later. What you wrote about not being nothing, I thought that was... He stopped. What? She asked. He turned then, and she saw it. That tiredness again, and underneath it, something else, something older. I thought it was the most sensible thing I'd read in a long time, he said, and I've read a lot of sensible things. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And the silence, this time, felt different from the silences at Margaret's table. It felt like something that had room in it. Mrs. Aldridge, he called toward the kitchen. Miss Carter's here. And the next 30 days began. She didn't sleep well that first night. The room they'd given her was on the east side of the house, a large room, larger than she needed. With a bed that had a real frame and a window that looked out over a portion of the ranch she couldn't quite see in the dark. She lay in that bed and listened to the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around her, and thought about Margaret's face on the porch that morning, and thought about her father's chair in the corner of the old house, and thought about the letter she'd written, and the one that had come back. And somewhere in the middle of all of that thinking, she fell into the kind of sleep that has no dreams worth remembering. By morning, she had made a decision. Whatever this was, this arrangement, this strange transaction that two tired and practical people had entered into for reasons that had everything to do with necessity and nothing to do with sentiment, she was going to treat it with the same stubbornness she'd been applying to every hard thing since she was 12 years old. She was going to see it clearly, and she was going to work it honestly, and she was going to know her own value before she let anyone else set the price. She washed her face in the basin and looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. She was not what they had expected. She had never been what people expected. She was beginning to wonder if that might be the most useful thing about her. She straightened her collar, picked up her ledger book, a real one, a habit she'd started at 15 when her father had shown her how to keep accounts, and went downstairs to learn what a ranch needed from the woman no one had wanted. She had 30 days. She intended to use every one of them. The ledger book became her first act of translation. Amelia had brought it down to the kitchen on that second morning, expecting to find the household accounts in some form she could work from. A box of receipts, a notebook, something that would tell her the shape of the operation she'd walked into. What she found instead, in the small room off the main hallway that appeared to serve as both an office and a storage closet for things that had no other home, was a wooden crate stuffed with papers in no particular order, some of them dated, some of them not, and a leather-bound ledger that had been used faithfully for approximately 8 months before stopping mid-page in the summer of 1880, 2 years prior, as if whoever had been keeping it had simply put down the pen one day and never picked it up again. She already knew from what little Jackson had said over that first quiet supper that his wife had died in the spring of 1880. She didn't say anything about what she'd found. She simply sat down at the desk with the crate and the abandoned ledger, and 2 hours later she had a working picture of the ranch's finances that was clearer than anything the crate had suggested was possible. The picture was not as good as it should have been for an operation this size. It wasn't in trouble. The cattle alone generated more income in a season than most men in Silver Hollow saw in a decade. But there were gaps, redundancies, suppliers charging rates that hadn't been renegotiated in years, and a payroll system that appeared to operate largely on memory and goodwill. Someone capable had kept things running, but running by habit rather than by management, and the difference between those two things was the kind of slow leak that didn't sink a ship immediately, but absolutely sank it eventually. She was still at the desk when Jackson came in after the morning's work, smelling of horses and cold air, and stopped in the doorway at the sight of the organized stacks of paper covering every available surface. "What happened in here?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I found your books," she said, without looking up from what she was writing. "The ones from 1880 onward are in reasonable shape. Before that is, she considered her words, an archaeological situation." He was quiet for a moment. "My foreman's been handling the numbers since—" He stopped. "Since your wife," she said, straightforwardly, because she'd found that with hard things the only useful approach was to name them rather than walk around them. She looked up then. "I'm not criticizing. Your foreman did a workable job, but workable and optimized are different things, and I thought you should know what the difference is costing you." She watched something cross his face. Not offense, which was what she'd half expected, but something more complicated. He came further into the room and looked at what she'd laid out, and she could tell from the way he looked at it that he could read numbers, that he wasn't a man who'd handed off his finances out of ignorance, but out of something else. Grief, probably. The particular paralysis of grief that made certain rooms unbearable and certain tasks impossible for longer than anyone planned. "How bad?" he asked. "Not bad. Inefficient." She turned the ledger toward him. "Here and here, the feed suppliers charging you roughly 12% above the going rate for this region. That's been the case for at least 3 years by what I can tell. Over time, that adds up," he said. "It does." He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down across the desk from her, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected him to look at the numbers, nod, and leave, to treat this as her domain now and remove himself from it. Instead, he sat down and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the ledger, the way a man looks at something he's been avoiding and has finally decided to stop avoiding. "Walk me through it," he said. So she did. For the better part of an hour, she walked him through what she'd found, and she discovered 2 things in that hour that rearranged her understanding of the man she'd agreed to spend 30 days with. The first was that he was not, as the stories had it, a man who operated purely on instinct and force of personality. He asked precise questions. He caught implications she hadn't stated outright. He remembered, without writing anything down, every figure she mentioned. The second thing she discovered was that he had known, on some level, that things had drifted. He hadn't looked because looking meant going back into that room, and he hadn't been ready to go back into that room. "Your wife kept the books," she said. Not a question. "She was better at it than me." "I can see that. Her system in 1879 is elegant. Whoever taught her knew what they were doing." "Her father," Jackson said. "He ran a mercantile in Ohio. She grew up behind the counter." He said it the way people say things they've carried a long time. Not with fresh pain, but with the weight of something that has become part of their ordinary structure. A load-bearing grief that you'd built everything else around because you didn't know how to put it down. Amelia didn't say she was sorry. She thought he'd probably had enough of that. Instead, she said, "If you want, I can have the books fully reconciled by the end of the week. And I can draft a letter to the feed supplier that will either get you a better rate or give you grounds to go elsewhere." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You do that a lot, don't you?" "Do what?" "Offer the practical solution right after the hard part," he said. "Like you're trying to give a person something to hold on to." She didn't know what to say to that. It was more perceptive than she'd expected and more personal than she'd prepared for, and she felt something uncomfortable move through her. The feeling of being accurately seen, which was not always a comfortable sensation, particularly when you'd spent most of your life expecting to be seen inaccurately. "It's just how I think," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm not criticizing." He stood up and put the chair back against the wall and paused in the doorway. "Supper's at 6. Mrs. Aldridge makes it earlier in winter so she can get home before dark." "I'll be there," Amelia said. He left. She sat at the desk for a moment without writing anything, her pen in her hand, looking at the place he'd been sitting. Then she opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top and started the column that would track the first changes she intended to make. She had 28 days left. The ranch workers noticed her before she understood she was being noticed. It happened gradually, the way most important things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small ones that added up to a changed situation. She was in the habit of being up before the house stirred, which at the Whitaker Ranch meant being up before 5, and she'd started walking the property in the early morning dark, not as exercise, but as intelligence gathering, learning the layout and the routine and the particular rhythms of an operation this size. She'd grown up with her father's small homestead, which was a different creature entirely from 3,000 acres of working cattle ranch, and she knew enough to know she didn't know enough, and she intended to close that gap as fast as possible. The first person to speak to her directly outside of mealtimes was a young ranch hand named Cody, who couldn't have been more than 17, and who she'd noticed on her second morning standing at the fence of the near pasture in the pre-dawn cold, watching the cattle with an expression of complete absorption that she recognized as the look of someone who genuinely cared about what they were looking at. "You count them every morning?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He startled. Clearly hadn't heard her. He was the kind of boy who got lost in things. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Whitaker likes a morning count. How many head in this pasture? 83. Should be 84, but old Tessie... He stopped, as if uncertain whether this was a conversation he was supposed to be having. Old Tessie what? She's been off her feed 2 days, I told the foreman. He said probably nothing. Cody said this in the careful tone of someone who didn't want to criticize the foreman, but wasn't certain the foreman was right. Where is she? He pointed to the far end of the pasture. Amelia climbed the fence rail. Not gracefully, not the way the girls in the dime novels climbed fences, but she got over it, and walked down through the cold grass to where a cow was standing slightly apart from the others, with her head at an angle that was, once you saw it, clearly wrong. She was not a veterinarian, but she was a woman who'd grown up on a working property, who'd watched her father nurse animals through bad winters, who'd been paying attention to things other people wrote off as details her whole life. She crouched down and looked at the animal's eyes and checked the obvious things, and walked back to where Cody was waiting at the fence. Get the ranch doctor, she said. Today, not tomorrow. That's not nothing. Cody looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded and went. By afternoon, the ranch doctor had been and confirmed what she'd suspected. The beginning of a respiratory infection that, if caught early, was manageable, and if left another day or two could move through a pasture with catastrophic speed. She didn't say anything about it at supper. She didn't think that was what you did. You didn't announce your contributions. You made them and let the results speak, and if people were paying attention, they'd notice. And if they weren't, the contributions still mattered because they'd happened. But the ranch workers noticed. She could feel it in the subtle shift in how they held themselves when she walked past in the mornings after that. Not deferential, not warmer exactly, but more present. They'd started taking her measure, which was better than being invisible. The foreman was a different matter. His name was Burl Haston, and he'd been with Jackson Whitaker for 11 years. He was a compact, capable man in his 40s, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked permanent, and opinions that had calcified along with it. He was not actively unfriendly to Amelia. He was something that was in some ways harder to work with. He was politely, consistently uninterested in anything she might have to say or observe, in the way of someone who has decided in advance that a thing is not worth their attention and sees no reason to revisit that decision. He'd say yes, and then do what he'd already intended to do. He'd listen to her observations with a patient expression that was the face of a man waiting for a thing to be finished so he could get back to what mattered. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who decided exactly what she was and where her authority ended, and wasn't going to be moved from that position by anything short of Jackson Whitaker saying otherwise. The trouble was that Jackson had not said otherwise. In the first week, he'd introduced her to the ranch operation in the same way you'd introduce a new piece of equipment. This is where things are. This is how they work. Come to me with questions. And he'd been fair about it, more fair than she'd expected, but there was a limit to how far fairness without authority took you, and she was running into that limit with Burl Haston at every other turn. It came to a head in the second week, on a cold Tuesday that had started badly when she'd found an error in the payroll records that amounted to 2 ranch hands having been underpaid by a meaningful amount for at least 3 months. She'd brought it to Haston. He'd told her she was probably reading the records wrong. She'd shown him the records. He'd said he'd look into it. By the next morning, nothing had happened, and both ranch hands were the same amount short, and she walked out to the barn where she knew Huston would be and found him and Jackson both there, which was not what she'd planned for. She stopped for exactly 1/2 second and then decided that the presence of an audience was not a reason to change what she was going to say. Mr. Haston, she said, the payroll error I brought you yesterday, has it been addressed? Haston glanced at Jackson, a quick cut of a glance, the kind that was both checking and communicating. I looked at it, he said. I think there may be some confusion about how Torres and McPherson have both been underpaid by $4.30 a month for at least 3 months, she said. I'd like to have that corrected this week. Now, Mrs. Carter, Haston started. Whitaker, she said. It'll be Whitaker. The barn was quiet except for the sound of horses and the wind outside, and the large sound of a silence in which Burl Haston reassessed something and Jackson Whitaker stood very still. I'll look at the numbers again, Haston said. I've already looked at the numbers, she said. I'd like them corrected, and I'd like Torres and McPherson to receive what they're owed going back to when the errors started. That's what I want to happen." She looked at Jackson then, directly. She wasn't asking permission. She was making clear in front of his foreman that she expected her authority in the household and its finances to mean something, or else the arrangement they'd made was already broken. Jackson looked back at her for a moment. Something was working through his face that she couldn't entirely read. Then he said to Hasten, "Get it done." Hasten nodded, once. He didn't look at Amelia. She thanked Jackson and walked back to the house and stood in the kitchen with her hands on the counter for a moment, breathing. Not dramatically, not the way women breathe dramatically in stories. Just steadying herself the way you did when something had required more than you'd wanted to spend on it. Mrs. Aldridge was at the stove and said, without turning around, "He's going to hate you for that." "Hasten?" Amelia said. "He doesn't like being told, especially not in front of the boss." "I know," Amelia said. "Doesn't bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It bothers me some," she said. "I'd rather he just fixed it when I asked him privately, but that wasn't what was happening." Mrs. Aldridge made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite amusement, and might have been both. She was a stout woman in her 50s who had worked for the Whitaker household for 7 years, and who had the specific quality of someone who had seen a great many things and kept her own counsel about most of them. In the first week, she'd been neither warm nor cold to Amelia. She'd been professional in the way of someone who had weathered a change of management before and was reserving judgment until she had more data. That night at supper, Jackson had been quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. His usual quiet was settled, internal, the quiet of a man who was comfortable not filling silence. This was the quiet of someone thinking something through. After Mrs. Aldridge cleared the plates and went home, he said, "What you did in the barn today?" "I know," she said. "I should probably have come to you first." "No," he said. "You shouldn't have had to." She looked at him. "Hasten's been running things his way for a long time," he said. "That's on me. I let it go on too long." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed. He did it when he was working something out. He's a good man and a good foreman, but that doesn't mean he gets to decide what you can and can't say in my house. "I wasn't trying to embarrass him," she said. "I know. He's the one who made it what it was." He set the cup down. "I'll talk to him." "You don't need to fight my—" "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm telling you I'm going to." And there was something in the way he said it, not possessive, not protective in the way that meant she was his to protect, but something more plain and harder to categorize, like he was saying, "You're not in this alone." Like he was making clear that the terms she'd come here with were terms he intended to honor, and not just on paper. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and felt that uncomfortable sensation again, of being seen accurately, and this time she didn't try to talk herself out of it. She just let it sit there. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee, and she opened her ledger, and they sat there in the quiet house for another 40 minutes, each doing their own work. And it was the most normal evening Amelia could remember and longer than she wanted to think about. The town got involved on the 9th day, which was earlier than she'd expected. She'd gone into Silver Hollow with Pete for the weekly supply run, which she'd decided to accompany for the same reason she'd been walking the property at 5 in the morning. She needed information, and you couldn't get information from a desk. The town looked the same as it always had from the outside, but towns were like people, in that the outside and the inside were frequently different things, and she had enough of a radar for social weather to feel the shift the moment they pulled up outside the general store. She felt it from 2 women on the wooden sidewalk who stopped talking when they saw her. She felt it from the man inside the store who was friendly to Pete and addressed questions about the order to Pete even when she was the one speaking. She felt it most clearly from a woman named Dorothea Hale, who was married to the owner of the Silver Hollow Bank and who had the bearing of someone who had been the first woman in every room she'd ever walked into and found that arrangement satisfactory. Dorothea Hale was not openly rude. She was something more sophisticated than rude. She was precisely, surgically kind, the kind that was really a very thorough examination presented in a soft voice. She came to speak to Amelia outside the store in the particular way of someone who had arranged the encounter rather than stumbled into it. "We've been so hoping to meet you," she said, and her smile was the smile of a woman who had been performing warmth for so long it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. "Jackson Whitaker is such an important part of this community. We're glad he's finding his footing again." "He seems to have found it," Amelia said. "His footing." Dorothea's smile stayed perfectly in place. "Of course. It's just, we all care about him. His friends care about him. We want to make sure," a pause, gentle as a door closing, "that this arrangement works out for everyone involved." Amelia understood this perfectly. She was not naive about what it meant when a woman who ran the social machinery of a town made a point of being the first to introduce herself with a speech about how people were watching. "That's very kind," Amelia said. "I'll pass your regards along to Mr. Whitaker." She got back in the wagon with Pete and did not say a word about it for the entire drive back. And Pete, who was operating on his usual economy of conversation, did not ask. But she sat with it. She sat with it through the rest of that day and into the next. Because Dorothea Hale was not the important thing. She was just the visible edge of the important thing. What mattered was the network of opinion and influence that woman represented, the web of people in Silver Hollow who had an investment in what happened at the Whitaker Ranch, and who had already decided that Amelia Carter, the girl nobody wanted, was an improbable solution to a situation she had no business being in. She thought about this carefully. She thought about what her father would have said, which was probably something about not being useful to spend too much time on what people thought of you, and quite a lot of time on giving them reason to revise what they thought. And she thought about what she had, which was 30 days and a ledger book and the beginnings of an understanding of the place she'd come to. And she thought about what those things were worth if she used them right. On the 11th day, she did something that surprised even herself. There was a family, the Caldwells, who worked a small portion of the Whitaker land under a leasing arrangement that had been in place for several years. She'd seen the arrangement in the paperwork, and she'd noticed that the Caldwells had been running consistently late on their quarterly payments, not by much, but with a regularity that told a story about the state of things over there. The standard response to late payment was a formal letter from Haston. She'd seen 3 of those in the files, each slightly sterner than the last. She went herself instead. She told Jackson she was going to visit the neighboring families to get a better sense of the territory, which was true enough. She drove herself, having established in the first week that she could manage a horse and wagon without assistance, a fact that had produced a complicated expression on Pete's face. And she arrived at the Caldwell place on a cold mid-morning to find a woman about 10 years older than herself trying to repair a fence with the particular focused energy of someone doing the work of 3 people. Her name was Ruth. Her husband had broken his leg in August and hadn't healed right, and could do light work but not the work the place required. She had 4 children and a determination that reminded Amelia of something, and they sat in her kitchen for an hour and talked, really talked. And by the time Amelia drove back to the ranch, she had a plan that was better than a formal letter. She wrote up the plan that night and put it on the desk for Jackson without saying anything. A modified payment schedule for the Caldwells through the winter, in exchange for Caldwell's oldest son, 16, capable, eager to work by Ruth's description, putting in 3 days a week at the main ranch through the hardest months. It spread the cost differently, kept the family from losing their arrangement, and gave the ranch extra labor at a time of year when Haston had been complaining about being short-handed. She heard Jackson reading it in the study across the hall. She couldn't hear the paper exactly, but she could sense the moment he got to the end of it. The stillness that followed was different from his usual stillness. He appeared in the doorway of the room she was using as her workspace. He had the paper in his hand. "You went over there yourself," he said. "I did. Hasten usually handles the Caldwells." "Hason's approach so far has been letters," she said. "Letters weren't going to fix this." He looked at the paper, then at her. "You talked to Ruth Caldwell for about an hour, and she agreed to this." "She proposed the part about the boy," Amelia said. "I just wrote it up." He was quiet for a moment. There was something happening in his face that she'd started to be able to read, just slightly. the way a person begins to learn the specific weather of another person's expression after enough days in close proximity. He was not performing composure. He was actually composing himself, which was different, and it was because something had moved him, and he was a man who was not in the habit of being moved in front of people. "I'll send word to the Caldwells tomorrow," he said finally. "I told Ruth I thought it would be approved," Amelia said. "I hope that was all right." He opened his mouth, closed it, then quietly, "Yeah, that was all right." He went back to the study. She went back to her ledger. Through the wall, she could hear the occasional turn of a page, and the fire in both rooms settling, and outside the Montana wind doing what it always did, which was reminding everyone who was in charge of the weather. 20 days left. She was getting the measure of the place, and the place was, she thought, beginning to get the measure of her. The workers said good morning now when she crossed the yard. Cody had started bringing her the morning count without being asked. Mrs. Aldridge had twice now asked her opinion about meals for large workdays, which was not a question Mrs. Aldridge asked casually. She was a woman who had her own opinions about meals and did not solicit outside input unless she thought it might be worth something. And Jackson. Jackson Whitaker was the part she hadn't figured out how to think about cleanly. He was a fair man. She'd understood that in the first few days, and she'd learned it more firmly in the second week. He was not easy to know. He was someone who'd built walls at the specific places where he'd been hurt before, the way people do, and the walls were solid, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise or imagine she had any particular right to see past them. But sometimes in the evenings at the supper table or in that hour when they both happened to be working in adjacent rooms, she would catch the shape of the person behind the walls, the dry humor that came out sideways when he was comfortable, the way he listened when she talked about the accounts, as if what she said genuinely mattered to him, the single time she'd seen him with Cody, talking through something about a horse, with a patience and a gentleness that was completely at odds with the man the territory's stories described. She didn't know what to do with any of that, so she filed it in her ledger, the mental one, the one her father had pointed to, and kept working. On the 14th day, exactly halfway through her 30 days, two things happened. The first was that she received a letter from Margaret. It was short, which was Margaret's way of signaling that she considered the matter settled and herself released from further obligation. It said the house had been leased to a family from Billings and that Amelia's remaining personal effects had been boxed and could be retrieved when convenient. It said nothing personal. It signed off with your aunt, M. Holloway, with the formality of someone who wanted to be on record as having done the appropriate thing. Amelia read it, folded it, and put it in the bottom of her traveling bag. She didn't take it out again. The second thing that happened was harder. She'd been in the supply room off the kitchen doing an inventory. Another gap she'd found, the kind of haphazard stockpiling that happened when no one was tracking what was used against what was purchased, when she heard voices in the hallway. Jackson's voice and another one she didn't recognize coming from the direction of the front door. She wasn't trying to listen. She was still working, running her pencil down the list she'd made, when she heard her name, her actual name, used in a tone that made her hand stop moving. "Carter, woman," the other voice said. It was a man's voice, older, with the round confidence of someone used to filling rooms. "Jackson, I've known you a long time. I'm saying this as a friend." "Then say it and be done," Jackson said. His voice was flat. "She's not what you need. I know the Holloway family. Margaret came to Thomas about the debt before she came to you. Did you know that? She was trying to sell that girl around to half the county before she landed on your door. What does that tell you?" A pause. Amelia had stopped moving completely. "It tells me Margaret Holloway is a woman who solves problems efficiently," Jackson said. "It tells you that this woman was the last option," the other voice said. Not cruelly. That was almost worse. Said matter-of-factly, the way obvious things are said. A girl nobody else wanted, Jackson. At her age, with her situation. I understand you needed someone, and she was available, but there are other solutions. Proper solutions. Women with families, with standing, women who could actually benefit your position in this. "I think you should go," Jackson said. A beat of silence. "I'm only trying." "I know what you're trying." Jackson's voice was still flat, but there was something underneath it now, a pressure behind it. "And I appreciate that you think you're being a friend, but I'm going to ask you to leave my house now." She heard the door. She heard it open and close, and then she heard the silence that followed it, and she stood in the supply room with her pencil in her hand and her list unfinished and the letter from Margaret still in her bag in the other room. And she thought about what she'd just heard. A girl nobody else wanted. She'd known that was what people thought. She'd known it in the way you know things you've been told your whole life. Not freshly, not as new information, but as the familiar weight of a familiar stone. She'd thought she'd gotten used to the weight. Standing in that supply room, she discovered she hadn't. She stayed there for a while, not moving, until she heard Jackson's footsteps come down the hall and stop outside the door. He didn't open it immediately. She thought, and she didn't know if she was reading this right, that he stood there for a moment first. Then he knocked once and opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression told her he wasn't sure how much she'd heard, but he suspected enough. "That was Charles Hale," he said. Dorothea Hale's husband. Of course it was. "I gathered," she said. "I want you to know—" "You don't need to," she said. Her voice was even. She was working hard to keep it even. "Amelia." It was the first time he'd used her given name, she noticed. She couldn't help noticing. "I want you to know that what he said, I don't—" He stopped and started again, and she could see that he was a man who was more comfortable with action than with this kind of conversation, who was working harder at this than it looked. "Margaret going to other people first doesn't change anything. You came here. That's what's real." She looked at him for a moment. The supply room was small and cold and smelled of dried goods and dust, and the light from the small window behind her was the flat gray light of a cloudy Montana afternoon, and this was about as far from the kind of scene where declarations happened as it was possible to get. "I know you're not Charles Hale," she said finally. "I knew that before today." Something in his face shifted. He nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. "Supper in an hour," he said. "I'll be there," she said. He left. She turned back to her inventory list. Her hand was not quite steady, but steady enough. She wrote down the numbers. She kept going. The 30 days passed without either of them mentioning the 30 days. That was the thing Amelia noticed first, in the final week of what was supposed to be the trial period, that neither she nor Jackson had referred to it directly since that first supper when the terms had been established. The 30 days had simply become the texture of ordinary life, one day following the next, and the arrangement that had been framed as provisional had started to feel like something else, something without a clean end date, and neither of them had said a word about it. She thought about bringing it up. She turned the conversation over in her mind on several mornings, practicing various versions of it while the ranch came to life outside her window. "We're approaching the end of the agreed period. I'd like to know what you're thinking." Or simpler, "It's been 30 days. What happens now?" Each version felt wrong in a different way. Too formal, too vulnerable, too much like pressing on something that was working precisely because no one was pressing on it. So she kept working, and he kept working, and the 30 days slipped past like water through a fence, and on the morning that would have been day 31, she woke up and got dressed and went downstairs and found that Mrs. Aldridge had made griddle cakes, which she only did on days when there was something to celebrate or something to get through, and Amelia couldn't tell which this was. Jackson was already at the table. He looked up when she came in, and he had an envelope in front of him that he slid across the table without preamble when she sat down. She looked at it. Her name was written on it in his handwriting, which she'd come to recognize, the same steady, unremarkable hand as the letter he'd sent accepting her terms. "What is this?" she said. "Open it." She did. Inside was a document, 2 pages, dense with the specific language of legal instruments. And it took her a moment of reading to understand what she was looking at, and then it took her another moment to trust that she was reading it correctly. It was a property agreement. It outlined her role in the management of the Whitaker Ranch with the kind of specificity that lawyers used when they wanted things to hold up in court. Her authority over the household accounts, her standing in negotiations with suppliers, her right to make operational decisions up to a specified threshold without prior approval. It was signed at the bottom by Jackson and dated 2 days ago, which meant he'd had it drawn up sometime in the middle of the second week, which meant he'd decided before she had. She set the document down on the table and looked at him. "I had it drawn up properly," he said, in the tone of a man who was trying to be matter-of-fact about something that wasn't entirely matter-of-fact. "So it's not just a conversation. So it holds." Jackson. "You don't have to—" "I wasn't going to argue," she said. "I was going to say thank you." He picked up his coffee and looked at the table and said, "Don't thank me. It's fair. It should have been in writing from the start." She signed the document after breakfast. She used the good pen from the study desk, the one with the worn grip that had clearly been used for every important signature the ranch had ever produced, and she signed her name clearly and set the pen down and thought about what her father would have made of that signature, of the name she was writing, of all of it. She thought he would have been pleased in the quiet way he was pleased by things, not effusively, not with a lot of words, but with a particular quality of stillness that meant something had gone right. It was 3 days after that when everything started to go wrong. She didn't know it at first. That was the nature of what was coming. It arrived in small, explicable pieces, each one reasonable on its own, and you only understood the shape of it when you had enough pieces laid side by side and stood back far enough to see the pattern. The first piece was the water. The spring that fed the main pastures on the north side of the ranch had been reliable for years. Cody had told her as much during one of their morning counts, the same count that was now just a natural part of her day. The boy reporting in with his numbers and his observations with the earnestness of someone who had finally found someone who would listen to them. But on a Thursday in the third week of October, Cody came to find her with a different expression. Not the usual focused alertness, but something tighter and younger looking. "The North Spring's running low," he said. "Not just low, like it's dropping." She went to look herself. The spring ran through a series of stone channels that had been constructed years ago to direct the water efficiently across the pasture system. And standing at the upper channel, she could see that Cody's assessment was accurate. The flow was not merely seasonal variation. Something was happening upstream. She told Jackson at lunch. He went out himself in the afternoon and came back with the look she'd come to associate with him processing something that didn't fit the pattern he expected. "There's been interference upstream," he said at supper. "Rocks. Deliberate. Someone blocked the channel," she said. "Started to. Not enough to stop the flow entirely yet. Enough to slow it." He turned his coffee cup in that particular way. "Could be kids. Could be someone who didn't know what they were doing." "Do you believe that?" she asked. A pause. "No," he said. She didn't either, but they had no evidence of anything more, and evidence was what mattered. She'd understood that her whole life, had understood it in the particular way of someone who'd spent years having impressions dismissed because they couldn't be proven, and she was not going to make accusations she couldn't support. So she wrote it down. Date, time, description of what had been found, Jackson's assessment. She wrote it in the back of her ledger, which had become by this point not just a financial record, but a running account of the ranch's daily life, the kind of document that a person with her training couldn't help keeping once she'd started. The second piece came 5 days later, and it was not something that could be explained as mischief. 2 of the ranch hands, Torres and McPherson, the same men whose payroll she'd corrected, which she noted and filed away, came in from the East Range at the end of a workday with a story that they told to Haston first, and that Haston brought to Jackson that evening, and that Jackson brought to Amelia. Someone had been through the east fence line, not a break, a cut, clean and deliberate, in 3 separate places spaced far enough apart that it wasn't the work of an accident or a loose wire. 23 cattle had drifted through before the hands found it. They'd recovered 18. The other 5 were somewhere on the other side of a property boundary that abutted land owned by a man named Victor Crane. The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Victor Crane was not a name she'd heard until 10 days ago, when Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned him in the context of a story about a land dispute from several years back. A dispute that Jackson had won, narrowly, through a combination of correct documentation and the testimony of 3 witnesses that Crane had apparently tried to discredit and failed. Crane owned the land to the east. He was, by every account she'd gathered since hearing the name, a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and who had a long memory for what he considered slights. He'll claim the cattle drifted naturally, Jackson said. He was standing at the window of the study, not sitting, which meant he was too restless for sitting. He'll say his men found them on his land and are holding them until ownership can be established. Can he do that? He can try. His voice was controlled, but barely. This isn't the first time he's tried something like this. The method changes, but the goal doesn't. What's the goal? He turned from the window. The ranch. He's wanted this land for 20 years. He came close to getting it once, before the title was confirmed. Since then, he searched for a word. Patient. He's a patient man. Amelia thought for a moment. She was doing what she always did when something complicated arrived. Not reacting, not performing calm, but genuinely processing, running through what she knew against what she'd been told against what the evidence suggested. The spring first, then the fence, she said slowly. He's not trying to take the cattle. The cattle are… what? A way to get you on his land, to force a confrontation. Jackson looked at her. Or to get you focused on the East Range, she continued, while something else is happening somewhere else. Is there anything… She paused, thinking, is there anything that Crane would want that's not the land itself? A contract? A right-of-way? A water claim? A silence. Then Jackson crossed to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and took out a folder of documents she hadn't seen before. Older paper, folded in the way of things that had been consulted many times. He laid them on the desk without speaking and stepped back. She came around the desk and looked. Water rights. The original claims, filed when the ranch was established, covering the spring and 2 creek systems that ran through the property. She could see the dates, the boundaries, the signatures. And she could see, when she looked at the water claim for the North Spring specifically, something that she stared at for a long moment before she was sure of what she was seeing. This claim, she said, putting her finger on the relevant document. The language in this section here, the boundary description, it's ambiguous. Jackson looked where she was pointing. His jaw tightened. The survey from 1874 used a marker, a particular rock formation as the northern boundary point, she said. If that rock formation could be argued to be in a different location than where it was recorded, then the upstream section could be argued to fall outside the claim, Jackson said, very quietly. Does Crane have a surveyor, someone who's been doing work in that area recently? Another silence. She could see him remembering something. There was a man, he said slowly. 2 months ago, Burl mentioned someone doing survey work on the Crane property near the North Line. Crane said he was planning a fence extension. She looked at him. He looked at her. He wasn't planning a fence extension, Amelia said. No, Jackson said. He wasn't. This was the moment she understood that what had been a difficult 30 days was about to become something significantly harder. The spring, the fences, the cattle on Crane's land, these weren't random harassments or the opportunistic maneuvering of a greedy neighbor. They were stages in a plan that had been in preparation for months, possibly longer, and the plan was not to steal a few cattle or slow down a water supply. The plan was to establish the legal groundwork to challenge the water claim, and if the water claim fell, a significant portion of the ranch's ability to sustain its herds during drought months fell with it, and a significant portion of the land's value fell with it. And then Victor Crane would be waiting. She went back to her ledger that night and wrote everything down. Every piece, every date, every connection she could identify. She wrote it in the careful, linear way her father had taught her. Not conclusions first, but evidence first. Evidence laid out in sequence so that the conclusions rose from the evidence naturally and couldn't be argued away. She wrote for 2 hours, and when she was finished, she read it back and made 3 additions and then sat with it. Jackson appeared in the doorway at some point. She wasn't sure how long he'd been there. You're building a record, he said. I'm building a record, she confirmed. He looked at the pages she'd filled. That's what we'll need. If this goes where I think it's going, we'll need documentation. I know. She looked up at him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. All right. Is there anyone on the ranch, any worker, anyone with access to the property, who might have a reason to help Crane? Not out of malice necessarily, out of money or pressure or something he offered them? The question sat in the room for a moment. She watched him wrestle with it, with the instinct to defend his people, which was natural and probably right most of the time, against the practical necessity of considering it honestly. Hasten's been with me 11 years, he said carefully. I know. But, he said, and then stopped. But, she agreed, there's a man, Deacons. He came on in the spring, good worker, but he came from the east side, from a property that borders Crane's land. He said it with the reluctance of a man naming something he'd hoped not to have to name. I don't have reason to suspect him. I don't want to suspect him. I'm not asking you to accuse him, she said. I'm asking you to be aware of him. Pay attention to where he is when things happen. That's all. He nodded slowly. And I'd like to ride out to the North Spring myself tomorrow, she said, with Cody. I want to see the upstream section. I'll come with you. You should go to Crane's eastern boundary and recover the cattle, she said, visibly. Make it clear you're not going to let that slide. If he's trying to pull your attention in two directions at once, we go in two directions. He looked at her for a long moment. We, he said. It was not a challenge. It was not surprised, exactly. It was the sound of a man noticing a word and deciding what to do with it. Yes, she said. We. He went to get his hat. The ride to the North Spring the next morning was cold in the way that October in Montana was cold. Not the killing cold of winter, not yet, but the cold that reminded you winter was coming and wasn't going to be talked out of it. Cody rode beside her with his usual concentration, and she let the silence be because Cody's silence was comfortable, unlike most silences she'd been handed in her life. The upstream section was a 40-minute ride from the ranch house, up into an area where the land folded into itself, where the ground was rockier and the grass grew in patches between exposed stone. She'd brought her ledger and a measuring rope and a compass, which had earned her a look from Cody that she chose to interpret as impressed. What she found upstream was what she'd expected, and worse than she'd expected. The blocking of the channel was more extensive than the first report had suggested. There were 2 additional intervention points that Jackson's quick inspection hadn't caught, placed at intervals that suggested someone who understood water flow and channel dynamics. This was not a hired hand with rocks. This was someone with technical knowledge. But what she found when she started checking the landmarks against the original survey description was more interesting and in some ways more useful. The rock formation cited in the 1874 water claim was exactly where the document said it was. She measured it against the compass bearing in the document. She measured the distance to the channel junction. She wrote everything down with the date and time, with Cody as witness, and she made Cody sign the page, which he did with the gravity of someone who understood they were being asked to do something that mattered. Is someone trying to steal the water? Cody asked. Someone is trying to make it look like we don't own the water, she said. There's a difference. He thought about this. The difference is what's on paper. Yes, she said. Exactly. She looked at the landscape around them, the way the rock formation sat, unmistakably in the position the 1874 survey described, the way the channel ran exactly where the claim said it ran. Whatever argument Crane's surveyor had been building, it was going to run directly into what she'd measured this morning, and what she'd measured was on paper now, dated and witnessed, sitting in her ledger. On the way back, Cody said quietly, Mr. Whitaker's different since you came. She looked at him. Different how? He seemed to be choosing his words with the care of a boy who'd learned that words could be taken wrong. Like he's less alone, Cody said finally. I don't know, he was here, he ran things, but he was alone inside it, if that makes sense. She rode for a moment without answering. It makes sense, she said. That evening, Jackson came back from the eastern boundary in a state she recognized as controlled fury, the kind of anger that had been compressed down into something cold and usable. He'd recovered the cattle. All 5. Crane's men had been waiting, which meant they'd been expected, which meant Crane had known Jackson was coming, which meant someone on the ranch had communicated it. Deacons, Jackson said. He said it to the wall of the study, not to her, but she was there. You know? One of the other men saw him talking to a rider on the East Road this morning, before we left. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something back. I don't know for certain, but I know. Don't fire him yet, she said. He turned. If he's reporting to Crane, he's more useful to us in place than gone, she said. If we let him keep reporting, we can control what Crane thinks he knows. Jackson stared at her. She watched the cold anger shift into something more complicated, something that was working through the implications. You want to feed Crane false information, he said. I want to give Crane the information that benefits us most, she said, which was not quite the same thing, but wasn't far from it either. He sat down heavily in the desk chair. He rubbed his face with both hands, one of the few completely unguarded gestures she'd seen from him, the gesture of a man who was tired and not performing otherwise. I've been fighting this man for 20 years, he said. 20 years of this. Every time I think it's settled, it's not settled because he hasn't paid a cost yet, she said. Every time you've fought him off, you've just fought him off. He goes away, he waits, he tries something else. He needs to lose something, not just fail, actually lose something. What do you have in mind? She told him. It took the better part of an hour to lay out the full shape of it, and in that hour she watched Jackson's face cycle through doubt, reluctant interest, something closer to respect, and finally the particular expression of a man who has been given a plan that he wishes he'd thought of himself. The plan was not simple. It required patience and documentation and the cooperation of several people whose cooperation she wasn't yet certain of, and it had a stage in the middle that depended on Victor Crane making the move she believed he was going to make, which was the part that couldn't be forced. What if he doesn't file the challenge? Jackson asked. He will, she said. He's been building toward it for months. The surveyor, the spring, the fence. He's not going to let all of that go without getting something for it. His pride won't allow it. You've never met the man. I've read everything about him in your files, she said, and I've met men like him, men who believe they're smarter than everyone in the room. They always press the advantage too far because they can't imagine being wrong. A silence. There's a lawyer in Helena, Jackson said. James Calloway. He's the one who handled the title dispute in '78. He's good. Can you get him here within the week? I can try. We need him here before Crane files anything, she said. Once Crane files, we're responding. I want to be ahead of this. Jackson looked at her across the desk, the same desk where she'd laid out the financial picture on her second day, the same lamp casting the same yellow light, but everything in the room feeling different from that first week, weighted differently, the two of them different in relation to each other in ways that hadn't been named and didn't need to be yet. I'll send a wire tomorrow, he said. Good. She started to gather her papers. He said, Amelia. She stopped. The plan you just laid out, he said carefully, is going to require you to go into Silver Hollow, to talk to people, people who, he paused, who've said things, who think things about you, about us. She understood what he was saying. He was telling her that she was going to have to walk into the town that had decided about her and make herself visible and do it without the protection of being invisible, which had always been the only protection she'd had. I know, she said. I can go instead, he said, for any of it. You can't go instead, she said. It has to be me. The people I need to talk to are the ones who won't talk to you directly, the wives, the women who know everything about everyone and control half of what gets decided in this county without anyone officially acknowledging it. She picked up her papers. I know how to talk to those women. I've been one of the people they talked about my whole life. That gives me an angle. He was quiet for a moment. You're not afraid of them, he said. It wasn't quite a statement, wasn't quite a question. I'm afraid of them, she said honestly. But I'm more afraid of letting Crane win. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, longer than she meant to, and she let herself feel the weight of what she'd just committed to. Not for long. She couldn't afford the luxury of extended fear. She'd never been able to afford it. But long enough to be honest with herself about what it was going to cost. Then she opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote down the names. There were 7 people in Silver Hollow whose position, whose relationships, whose access to the right conversations made them essential to what she was planning. 7 people she had to reach before Crane made his move, and of those 7, 5 were women. And of those 5, 1 was Dorothea Hale. She stared at Dorothea Hale's name for a while. Then she wrote next to it, "Start here," because the hardest conversation was also the most important one, and she'd learned from her father, from the 6 months of managing an impossible debt on her own, from 30-something days on a ranch that everyone had expected to break her, that the right thing to do and the easy thing to do were almost never the same thing, and you picked one or you picked the other, and the one you picked was the one that showed you who you actually were. She was in Silver Hollow before 9 the next morning. The day was gray and cold, and the town was going about its business with the particular momentum of a place that didn't wait for the weather to improve. She tied the horse at the rail outside the general store and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and let the town see her, but standing straight, coat buttoned, ledger under her arm. And then she walked to the Hale house on the north side of the main road and knocked on the door. Dorothea Hale answered it herself, which Amelia hadn't expected. She'd expected a housekeeper, a moment of being received. Instead, the door opened and Dorothea stood there in a house dress and an expression of complete surprise, and Amelia had the rare experience of catching this woman off guard, which she suspected didn't happen often. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dorothea said, recovering. "Mrs. Hale." She didn't wait to be invited. She stepped forward in a way that made invitation a formality. "I need 20 minutes of your time. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." They sat in the parlor, the good parlor with the good furniture and the evidence of a woman who had spent considerable energy building the right version of her home. Tea appeared, which Amelia hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want, but accepted because the ritual of it gave Dorothea something to do with her hands while she calibrated. "I'm going to tell you about Victor Crane," Amelia said without preamble, "and what he's planning to do to the Whitaker Ranch. And I'm going to tell you why it matters to you specifically." Dorothea's expression was careful. "I don't see what Victor Crane's business has to do with—" "He's moving against the water rights on the north section," Amelia said. "He has a surveyor's report that he's planning to use to challenge the 1874 claim. If he succeeds, the ranch loses access to primary water for the north pastures. That reduces the herd capacity by roughly a third. That reduces the tax base of this county's largest single landholding." She let that sit for a moment. "Your husband runs the bank, Mrs. Hale. The Whitaker Ranch holds accounts and paper with the Silver Hollow Bank that represent a significant portion of your husband's portfolio. A weakened ranch hurts your bank." The careful expression had changed. Not dramatically. Dorothea Hale was not a woman who did anything dramatically in front of a person she was still deciding about. But the quality of her attention had changed. She was listening now with the full weight of her intelligence, and Dorothea Hale was not, Amelia was realizing, a stupid woman. She was a woman who had deployed her intelligence in a specific direction and had been very successful at it. "Victor Crane," Dorothea said slowly, "has had accounts with my husband's bank for 12 years. "I know," Amelia said. "That's why I came to you first. Because you're not going to want to be on the wrong side of this when it's over, and you're well positioned to help it come out right, and I think you're smart enough to see both of those things clearly." A silence. Outside, the town went about its business. A horse went past the window. Somewhere a door banged. "Your husband told Jackson to get rid of you," Dorothea said, bluntly. Not unkindly, in the end. Just the truth. The way Amelia had offered her truth, one hard thing for another. "Your husband was wrong," Amelia said, with respect. Something crossed Dorothea Hale's face then that Amelia hadn't expected and couldn't fully read. A flash of something that was either amusement or recognition or possibly both. Then the composed expression came back, and Dorothea picked up her teacup and held it in both hands the way women hold things when they're thinking. "Tell me exactly what you need," she said. Amelia opened her ledger, and she told her. Dorothea Hale was not a woman who did things halfway. Amelia had understood this about her from the parlor visit, had read it in the quality of the woman's attention, in the way she'd asked her questions, in the particular thoroughness with which she'd wanted to understand not just what Amelia needed, but why each piece mattered and how it connected to the others. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the speed. Within 2 days of that conversation, Dorothea had quietly spoken to 4 women whose husbands represented the most significant business interests in Silver Hollow. And within 4 days, those women had spoken to their husbands, and within 5 days, Thomas Hale had called a private meeting at the bank that did not include Victor Crane and did include the county land commissioner, a man named Arthur Briggs, who had apparently been carrying his own suspicions about Crane's surveying activities for some time and had been waiting for someone to give him a reason to act on them. Amelia learned all of this secondhand from Dorothea in a second meeting that happened not in the good parlor, but in a back room of the Hale house that served as Thomas Hale's home office and felt significantly more serious. Thomas Hale was there this time, which told her the nature of the conversation had changed. He was a stout man with a banker's caution and a banker's instinct for which way things were going to fall. He looked at her across the desk with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man revising a prior assessment and not entirely comfortable with the revision. "My wife tells me you've been keeping records," he said. "I keep records of everything," she said. "May I see them?" She'd brought the relevant pages. She set them on his desk, and he read them with the focused quiet of someone who understood what he was looking at. Then he looked up. "This is thorough," he said. There was something in his voice that might have been surprise and might have been something closer to respect, and she thought about Charles Hale in Jackson's barn, saying a girl nobody else wanted, and she let the memory sit there briefly, and then she set it aside, because there were more useful things to do with the next hour than carry old weight into it. "The documentation from the North Spring is the critical piece," she said. "Cody Marsh witnessed the measurements and signed the page. He's 17, but he's credible. He's been on the Whitaker payroll for 2 years, and he's got no connection to anything except the ranch." Thomas Hale nodded. "And Calloway's coming from Helena. He should be here by Friday." "Good." Hale folded his hands on the desk. "Crane filed a preliminary inquiry with the land office yesterday. It's not a formal challenge yet, but it will be within a week. He's moving." She'd expected this. The preliminary inquiry was exactly the step that came before a formal water rights challenge. A procedural signal that amounted to a man clearing his throat before he said the thing that was going to start a fight. Crane was on schedule, which meant she needed to be ahead of schedule. "We need Briggs to complete his review of Crane's surveyor's credentials before the formal challenge is filed," she said. "If the surveyor's report is the foundation of Crane's case, and the surveyor turns out to have produced work that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, the foundation collapses," Hale said. "Before it's ever formally entered," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "Mrs. Whitaker, I owe you an apology." She waited. "What I said to Jackson, about how this arrangement came about you being a last option. It was said poorly, and it was unkind, and I was wrong." He said it with the gravity of a man who had been told by his wife to say it and had thought about it enough to mean it. "You've handled yourself here in a way that a great many people couldn't have." She thought about several responses. She chose the honest one. "I appreciate you saying that, but what I need more than an apology is your support in the room when Calloway presents to the land commissioner. Crane has money, and he has connections, and the people in that room are going to be watching to see whether Silver Hollow's most significant bank is behind the Whitaker position or standing to the side." Hale blinked. He hadn't expected to be turned back to business that quickly. "You'll have it," he said. She rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon with the particular feeling of something in motion, not resolved, not safe, but moving in the right direction with enough momentum to be felt. It was the same feeling she'd had occasionally in the old house, managing the accounts through those last hard months when she'd find the combination of numbers that would buy another week, another month. The feeling of a solution assembling itself from parts that had looked useless on their own. Jackson was waiting at the barn when she came in. He'd developed a habit she'd noticed but not commented on. When she was out and he was at the ranch, he tended to be somewhere near the yard around the time she'd be expected back. Not anxiously, not pacing, just available, present in the way that meant something without requiring a name. "Hale's in," she said, handing off the horse. Something relaxed in Jackson's face. "How'd you manage that?" "His wife managed it first," she said fairly. "I just gave her the right information to work with." "Dorothea Hale," he said. There was something in his voice, not disbelief exactly, but the sound of someone revising a map. "You went to Dorothea Hale." "She knows everyone and her husband runs the bank," Amelia said. "She was the right starting point. I just had to make sure she understood where her interests actually sat. She spent the better part of 2 months making your life difficult." "I know." She started toward the house. But she did it because she thought she was protecting something. The town's interests, her husband's business, the social order she'd built. Once she understood that Crane's move actually threatened those things, she wasn't hard to bring around. She's practical. She paused. More practical than she lets on. Jackson fell into step beside her. Calloway wired. He'll be here Friday afternoon. Good. I need to prepare what I'm going to present to him. What you're going to present to him, he repeated. Yes. She glanced at him. Do you have a problem with that? No, he said. And then, after a moment, it's my ranch, Amelia. She stopped walking. I know it's your ranch. I know you know, he said. He was working on the words carefully, which she'd learned meant the thing underneath them was something he was navigating rather than stating. I'm not saying you've overstepped. You haven't. I'm saying... He stopped, started again. I should be the one in the room with Calloway, standing next to you, not handing it off to you. She looked at him in the fading afternoon light. This was one of the things she hadn't figured out how to name yet. The way he sometimes pulled back from what she was doing, not because he objected to it, but because he'd been a man alone so long that another person carrying something he thought of as his weight felt like something he needed to justify to himself. I wasn't planning to be in the room instead of you, she said. I was planning to be in the room with you. He was quiet. The documents are mine, she said. The records I kept. The measurements from the spring, the account I built of every incident since the water was first blocked. Those need to come from me. But you know this land. You know the history of the claim. You know Crane. Calloway needs both of those things. She held his gaze. This is not something I can do without you. I haven't been doing it without you. Something in him settled. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man, but she could see it in the way his shoulders changed, a small release of something he'd been carrying. All right, he said. All right, she said. They walked the rest of the way to the house in the comfortable quiet that had become, over the past weeks, one of the things she would miss most if she had to leave. The question of Deacons had been sitting at the back of everything, a problem she hadn't solved yet, and it came to the front on the Wednesday before Calloway arrived. She'd been watching him the way she'd told Jackson to watch him. Not staring, not in a way that would alert him, but with the peripheral attention of someone who kept track of where people were in relation to what was happening. What she'd observed over the preceding week was a pattern. Deacons worked hard, visibly, during the parts of the day when Jackson or Haston was likely to be watching. And in the gaps, the early mornings before the main work started, the end of the day when men were heading in for supper, he found reasons to be near the east boundary, near the roads that connected to Crane's land. She didn't have proof. She had a pattern, which wasn't the same thing. And she'd built enough of her recent life on the difference between patterns and proof that she wasn't going to rush this. But then Cody came to her on Wednesday morning with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. I need to tell you something, he said, and I don't know if I should. Tell me, she said, and I'll decide if it's the right thing. Last night, Cody said carefully, I was up late. Couldn't sleep. I went to the barn to check on the mare that's been favoring her left leg. He was looking at his hands. Deacons was in the barn, which men come to the barn at night sometimes. That's not strange. But he had a piece of paper, and when he saw me, he put it in his coat fast and said he was checking on one of the geldings and left. Amelia was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything else? No, but the gelding he said he was checking on was in the far pasture, not in the barn. Cody looked up. I didn't say anything to him. I wasn't sure what to do. You did right to come to me, she said. Don't say anything to anyone else, not Haston, not the other men. Just go about your day normally. Cody nodded and went. She sat with it for 20 minutes, and then she went to find Jackson. He listened to what she said. His face went through several things. Then he said, I want to go talk to Deacons right now. Not yet, she said. Amelia, if we confront him now, Crane knows we know. He adjusts. We lose whatever information Deacons is carrying. She could see Jackson fighting the impulse. The direct confrontational response was natural to him, was probably what had kept him alive and solvent for 2 decades on a hard frontier, and she wasn't dismissing it. After Calloway leaves Friday, after whatever we're going to present to the land commissioner is already in motion. Then we deal with Deacons. We can afford to wait 3 days. We cannot afford to tip Crane off now. His jaw was tight. 3 days. 3 days, she said. And in the meantime, we make sure Deacons doesn't hear anything real. If he's carrying information, we give him something to carry that we choose. She watched Jackson process this. She could see the moment it settled, not agreement exactly, which suggested it had been a debate, but recognition, which meant he'd gotten there himself. "What do we give him?" Jackson said. "We let Haston mention, in earshot of Deacons, that Calloway's visit is about a potential sale of the North Pasture section, that Jackson's considering whether the water dispute is worth the fight and might be open to negotiating with Crane directly." Jackson's expression was the expression of a man being asked to do something that went against a decade of instinct. "Crane will think I'm about to fold." "Crane will think you're about to fold," she confirmed, "which means he'll press forward with the water challenge immediately, because he'll want to have it in place before any negotiation happens. He'll move faster than he planned. Fast movement creates mistakes." The calculation worked through Jackson's face. If he moves fast, Briggs won't have had time to finish the review of the surveyor's credentials. And if Briggs is already in the process of that review when the formal challenge is filed, the challenge lands on a desk that's already skeptical of it, Jackson said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You planned this from the start." "I planned the shape of it," she said. "The details have been filling in as things happened. How much of this is—" He paused, and she could see him trying to find the right question. "How much of this is you having done this kind of thing before, and how much of it is just how you think?" It was an odd question. She thought about it honestly. "My father had a neighbor who tried to challenge our well rights when I was 60, she said. "It didn't go the way the neighbor planned. My father never raised his voice once in the whole process." She paused. "I watched him build the case from the kitchen table over 3 months. I did some of the writing for him, the last month, when his eyes were giving him trouble. I learned more from that than from anything else I can think of." Jackson looked at her for a long time. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man." "He was a quiet man," she said. "People mistook that for ordinary. He wasn't ordinary." She felt the familiar ache of it, worn smooth now, like a stone in a river. "He'd have liked this ranch." "I'd have liked to meet him," Jackson said. Simply, with the straightforward weight of something he meant. She didn't answer that. She didn't have an answer that was the right size for it. She just nodded and went back to her work. Calloway arrived Friday at 2 in the afternoon and was everything Amelia had hoped for in a lawyer, and several things she hadn't expected. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s, with a neat appearance and sharp eyes that moved over a room the way her own eyes moved, noting and cataloging. And he had the quality she valued most in people who dealt with complicated situations, which was that he listened completely before he spoke. He sat across from her and Jackson in the study for 2 hours, while she presented everything she'd assembled, and he did not interrupt except to ask precise questions at precise moments, and when she was done, he was quiet for 30 seconds. She counted, before he said anything. "The measurements from the spring," he said. "Witnessed by Marsh." "Yes." "Dated, signed, with the compass-bearing notations matching the 1874 document." "And you have the original survey document." "Jackson has it. It's been in the ranch files since 1874. Calloway looked at Jackson. "The original, not a copy." "The original," Jackson said. Calloway sat back. "That's unusual. Most ranches of this age have lost their originals, say, water damage, fire, disorganization. Having the original document alongside a fresh measurement that confirms its accuracy is—" He seemed to be choosing the word with some care. "It's a strong position. Crane's surveyor will have produced a report. That report will have to contradict the original document directly. And an original 1874 survey document, when compared in court to a fresh survey conducted by a man whose credentials are currently being examined by the land commissioner—" "Does that help us?" Jackson said. "That helps you considerably," Calloway said. He stayed through supper, which Mrs. Aldridge seemed to have decided was an event worth feeding properly, and over the meal the conversation shifted from the legal specifics to the larger shape of things, Crane's history, the pattern of attempts over the years, the network of people who'd been quietly moving against the Whitaker Ranch for longer than any single incident suggested. Calloway listened to all of it and added it to whatever structure he was building in his head. After supper, he and Jackson talked alone for an hour in the study. Amelia worked at her desk in the adjacent room, aware of the low voices without straining to hear them, and somewhere in that hour she felt a shift, a different quality to the problem she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, a slight decrease in the particular tension that had been living between her shoulder blades since the first morning Cody had told her about the spring. They were ahead of it. Not safe. She wasn't naive enough to call it safe, but ahead, which was what she'd been trying to build since the night she'd sat with Jackson and named the shape of Crane's plan. The formal challenge came on Monday. She knew before the papers arrived because Haston came in from the yard with a particular expression. Not panicked. Haston didn't panic, but with the look of a man who needed to deliver news and was thinking about how to do it, and told Jackson that a land office representative had come to the gate with documents. Jackson took the documents without opening them and brought them to the study and set them on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Amelia, who had followed from the hallway. "It started," he said. "It's been started for a while," she said. "Now it's official." She picked up the documents and read them. The challenge was filed in the name of Crane's Land Company, not Crane personally, which told her something about the legal strategy, a corporation creating distance between the man and the action, and it cited the surveyor's report she'd been expecting and challenged the eastern boundary of the 1874 water claim on the specific language she'd identified when she first read the original documents in the ranch files. It was well constructed. She could see where the seams were, but you had to look. She set the papers down. "Send word to Calloway." Jackson was already reaching for the telegraph form. What happened next was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was a week of papers and counterpapers, of meetings in offices in Silver Hollow and one in the county seat that required an overnight stay, of conversations with Arthur Briggs at the land office that were careful on both sides and communicated more in what wasn't said than in what was. Amelia was present for every meeting she was permitted to be present for, and for the ones she wasn't, Calloway was, and she prepared him for each one with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a lawyer was only as good as the information he carried in. Crane's surveyor's credentials came apart on a Thursday. It was not dramatic when it happened. These things rarely were, outside of what people imagined. Briggs's review had found 3 prior surveys conducted by the same man for properties in 2 adjacent counties, and in 2 of those surveys there were measurable discrepancies between the reported landmarks and the actual landmarks that went beyond the margin of error that survey work allowed. The findings were documented in a 4-page report that Briggs delivered to the land office that same Thursday, and by Friday morning the report had been formally attached to the record of Crane's challenge, which meant that anyone reading the challenge would read the credential questions alongside it. Calloway brought them the news himself. He rode out to the ranch on the Friday morning and sat in the study and said, "The challenge isn't dead. Crane can find another surveyor, can try to file a supplemental report. But the first report is compromised, and compromised early. Any judge who looks at this case is going to look at the beginning of it and see a challenge survey and an original document that says the opposite. That's not an insurmountable position for Crane, but it's a significantly worse one than he walked in with." "What does he do next?" Jackson said. "He can continue the legal challenge. He can look for a settlement, try to get some concession out of you in exchange for withdrawing. Or he can try something outside the legal process." Calloway paused on that last one, with the specific pause of a man who is about to say something that he considers important. "I want you to be careful. Men like Crane, when the paper starts going wrong, sometimes revert to methods that don't involve paper." The room was quiet. "He's done that before," Jackson said. "Not here, but there are stories." "I've heard the stories," Calloway said. After Calloway left, Amelia told Jackson about Deacons. She told him it was time. The formal challenge was filed, the documents were in the public record. There was nothing Deacons could carry back to Crane that would change what was already in motion. The reason for waiting had passed. Jackson listened to her reasoning and agreed with it and said, "I want to do it myself." She didn't argue. It was right that he do it himself. She wasn't there for the conversation between Jackson and Deacons, which happened in the barn on a Friday afternoon. She heard it afterward from Jackson, standing in the kitchen while Mrs. Aldridge was out. He told it the way he told things, economically, with the relevant details, without editorializing. Deakins had not denied it. That was the thing that surprised both of them, that when Jackson sat across from him with the list of observations and the question put plainly, the man had not lied or deflected. He'd sat with it for a moment, and then he'd said that Crane had approached him in the summer, before he came to the Whitaker Ranch, and made promises about land and money that had seemed more real than they'd turned out to be. He'd said he understood what he'd done, and that he was ready to go. He looked, Jackson said, like a man who'd been waiting to be caught so he could stop. "Did you want to—" she started. "Yes," he said, "but I didn't." He'd let Deakins go with his pay through the end of the month and without a report to anyone that would follow the man to the next place he tried to work. It was more generous than Amelia would have been, she admitted to herself. But it was the choice Jackson could live with, which was the only standard that mattered for a decision like that one. "Crane's going to know the moment Deakins shows up without being sent," she said. "I know, which means whatever Crane is planning to do next, he's going to do it soon." Jackson looked at her. Calloway said to be careful. "I heard him." "I want more men on the east boundary," he said, "and I want the North Spring watched. I know we have the documentation, but I don't want him doing any more physical damage while this is in the legal process. It complicates things." "Agreed." She pulled her ledger toward her and opened it. "I'll talk to Haston about the rotation. He'll listen now." This was true. Something had shifted with Haston in the last week, a gradual, reluctant acknowledgement of a new reality. It hadn't come with any announcement. It had come the way real changes come, through accumulated evidence that the person you'd dismissed had been right too many times to keep dismissing. She was halfway through writing the rotation plan when Jackson said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up. He was standing at the window with his arms crossed, looking out at the ranch, and she could see the familiar structure of him against the late afternoon light, the particular way he stood when he was working through something that mattered. "When the lawyer came in 78, he said, for the title dispute, I was alone in this. I had Haston, and I had Calloway, and I had the documents. And I won, just barely. And after it was over, I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it was the hardest I'd ever had to fight for something that should already have been mine by every right." She waited. "This has been harder," he said. "Crane's been more patient. He's been smarter about it. He's come at us from more directions at once." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "But I haven't felt alone in it. Not once. Not since you sat down with those accounts in the first week and started telling me what you saw." He paused. "I want you to know that. I don't say things like that easily." She knew he didn't. She'd observed enough of him by now to understand exactly how much that cost, and exactly what it meant. "I know," she said. "I'm not—" He seemed to be navigating something. "I'm not saying it to make you feel obligated to anything, the arrangement, the terms we discussed. That's still yours to decide." She looked at him across the room. He meant it. She could read him well enough now to know that the offer of freedom was real, that he would not hold her to anything she didn't choose. And she thought about the letter she'd written at the kitchen table in the old house in Silver Hollow, the letter that had described herself without apology, the one that had ended with, "I am not nothing." She thought about his response. "I read your letter myself." She thought about 31 days that had become 60, that had become the unremarked texture of daily life, and about the feeling she had every morning when she came downstairs and found him already at the table, the feeling of a place that had started to feel like hers, not because it was given to her, but because she'd built her way into it. "I know it's still mine to decide," she said. "I decided it a while ago." The room was quiet. The fire in the kitchen had burned down to coals, and the light was going, and outside the Montana evening was doing what it always did, settling in with a cold and particular certainty. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went back to the rotation plan. He came to stand at the desk beside her and looked at what she was writing, and she moved the lamp slightly so he could see better. And they stood there together in the diminishing light working on the problem in front of them. And neither of them said anything more about what had just happened, because some things don't need more than what they've already been given. It was 2 days later that Crane made his final move, and it did not come, as Calloway had warned, in the form of paper. She was crossing the yard on a cold morning with her ledger under her arm when Pete came fast around the corner of the barn at a pace that was wrong for Pete, who did not move fast for anything short of actual emergency. He pulled up when he saw her, and there was something in his face that she had never seen there before in the weeks of their limited acquaintance, something shaken, which she hadn't believed Pete capable of being. "They hit the north fence," he said. "All of it. Overnight. And the spring? Someone's broken the stone channel, the one you measured." She stopped moving. "The cattle?" she said. "Still in the pasture, but the fence is down. They'll drift. And the water?" Pete shook his head. "It's not a block this time. They broke the channel itself. The stone." She stood for exactly 2 seconds, feeling the specific quality of this moment. Crane stepping past the legal process entirely, Crane making it physical because the paper was going wrong and the paper was all that was supposed to have gone wrong. And she felt something that surprised her, which was not fear and not even anger, but a clean and clarifying fury, the kind that didn't cloud thinking but sharpened it. She turned and walked fast to find Jackson. He was coming out of the barn. He saw her face. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. "Get the men. I'll get the ledger and the documentation. We're going to the land office this morning, not when it's convenient. This morning, before Crane has time to establish any other version of what happened." Jackson looked at her for a moment. Then he put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a whistle that carried across the entire yard, and the ranch came awake around them. She went inside for her documents. Whatever Victor Crane had expected from the woman who'd arrived at the Whitaker Ranch in a borrowed wagon with a dish towel in her hands and a ledger under her arm, it was clear by that cold October morning that he had badly miscalculated what she was willing to do and how far she was willing to go. She walked back out into the yard with every relevant page she'd written since the night she'd first heard the name Victor Crane, and she thought, with a certainty that sat in her chest like a warm coal in cold weather, "This ends today." The ride into Silver Hollow that morning was the coldest of the season. Amelia sat beside Jackson in the wagon with her documents in her lap and her hands flat on top of them, feeling the bite of the October air against her face, and she thought about what her father used to say about moments that required everything you had, that you didn't rise to them. Not really. You just stopped holding back what you'd already built. She understood that better now than she had at 20, at 22, at every age she'd tried to apply it. You didn't become someone different when the hard moment arrived. You found out who you'd been all along. Pete rode ahead. 2 other ranch hands followed behind. Jackson had his jaw set in the way she knew meant he was holding a great deal very still, and she did not try to talk him out of that stillness because it was the right thing for him to be doing right now. The land office in Silver Hollow occupied a narrow building on the east side of the main road, wedged between the assayer's office and a dry goods store, and it had the look of a place that handled more consequence than its size suggested. Arthur Briggs was already there when they arrived. She had sent Cody ahead on horseback 2 hours before dawn with a note that said, "Only Crane moved against the property overnight. We're coming in. Please be there." Briggs had the note in his coat pocket when he met them at the door, and his expression told her he'd been expecting something like this. Had perhaps been expecting it since the moment he'd attached his credential review to Crane's challenge. "Come in," he said, and stepped aside. The next 3 hours were not dramatic in the way that people imagined important things were dramatic. There were no raised voices, no sudden revelations, no single moment where the room turned and everything changed. It was paperwork and testimony and the careful, patient work of establishing a record that was too complete to be argued around. She laid everything out on Briggs's desk in the order she'd organized it weeks ago. The financial records that showed the pattern of interference mapped against dates, the measurements from the North Spring with Cody's signature, and the compass bearings, the log she'd kept of every incident from the blocked water channel to the cut fence lines to the overnight destruction of the stone channel. Each entry dated and detailed and written in the same steady hand she'd been writing in since she was 15 years old at her father's kitchen table. Calloway arrived 40 minutes in. He'd ridden through the night from the county seat when Jackson's wire reached him, and he looked like a man who'd ridden through the night. But his mind was sharp, and he went straight to the documents without being directed and began building the legal architecture around what she'd assembled. Briggs read everything twice. He was a methodical man, which was the right kind of man for this work. And he didn't speak much during the reading, but she could track his progress through the material by the small shifts in his expression. The tightening around his eyes when he reached the fence incident. The particular stillness that came over him when he read the description of the overnight destruction of the stone channel that she and Cody had measured and documented 6 weeks earlier. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked across the desk. "This is systematic," he said. "Not opportunistic. Systematic." "Yes," she said. "The destruction of the channel. That's criminal interference with established water infrastructure. That's not a civil matter." He looked at Jackson. "That changes what options are available to you." Jackson looked at Amelia. She'd known this was a possibility, but hadn't wanted to assume it, because assumptions about outcomes were the thing that made people careless in the middle of a fight they hadn't won yet. But Briggs was right, and the implication of him being right was significant. The moment Crane's action crossed from legal maneuvering into deliberate destruction of documented property, the nature of the case changed. It stopped being only a water rights dispute and became something with broader consequences. Consequences that Victor Crane, for all his patience and his planning, appeared not to have thought through carefully enough. "What would you need to proceed on that basis?" Calloway said to Briggs. "What I have here is a strong start," Briggs said. "I'd want a sworn statement from the witnesses who found the damage this morning, and I'd want photographs of the channel before any repairs are made." Jackson leaned forward. "We have a witness to Crane's man being on our eastern boundary 2 weeks ago, a ranch hand who was approached by Crane before he came to work for us, and who admitted to passing information." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Would that man make a sworn statement?" "I don't know," Jackson said honestly. "I let him go without conditions. He might." It was Amelia who said quietly, "He might." He didn't seem like a man who'd set out to do what he ended up doing. He seemed like a man who'd made a bad decision and lived with it longer than was good for him. She paused. "Sometimes those men are the most willing to set the record straight, once they're out from under the thing they agreed to." Briggs looked at her. He'd been looking at her at intervals throughout the morning in the way of someone recalibrating. She was used to that look from men in official positions, the look of someone who had expected less and was adjusting. "If you can get that statement," Calloway said to Jackson, "I can have a filing ready by end of week that puts Crane in a position he won't easily recover from. Not just the water challenge dismissed, which I believe it will be given what's here, but an active proceeding for property interference and potentially conspiracy to defraud a legitimate land claim." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Silver Hollow went about its morning. A wagon went past, harness jingling. Somewhere a door opened and closed. "Do it," Jackson said. He found Deakins 2 days later. The man had gone to a boarding house in a town 12 miles east, which was about as far as a man with his situation and his conscience was likely to get before stopping. Jackson rode there himself, alone, and came back the same evening with a signed statement in his coat pocket and a look on his face that was tired in a way that wasn't entirely about the writing. He gave Amelia the statement without ceremony. She read it at the kitchen table while he washed up at the basin, and what she read was the full account: Crane's approach in the summer, the money offered, the specific instructions about what to watch for and what to report. The night 2 weeks ago, when Deakins had been told that men would be moving against the fence and the channel, and that he should make sure the night watch rotation kept certain ranch hands away from the north boundary. He'd written it in plain language, signed it at the bottom, and had it witnessed by the boarding house keeper. "He volunteered the last part," Jackson said, drying his hands. "About the night watch. I didn't ask him about it directly." "He wanted to give you enough to finish it," she said. "Yeah." He sat down across from her. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had been fighting something for a very long time and could feel the ground shifting under it. Not relief, not yet, it wasn't over yet, but the early sensation of a weight beginning to move. 20 years, he said. 20 years of this man. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What will you do when it's actually finished?" He looked at the table. "Sleep, probably." Uninterrupted. He said it with the dry delivery that she'd come to understand was the front edge of something more genuine. "Fix the channel. Get the north fence rebuilt before the first hard snow." He paused. "Try to be a person who isn't always waiting for the next thing Crane's going to try." That last one's hardest, she said. I know. She folded the statement carefully and set it with the rest of the documents. She thought about what it meant, not the legal meaning, which she understood clearly, but the human meaning, the cost of what they'd both spent to get here. Deakins hadn't set out to be the kind of man who'd ended up in a boarding house 12 miles from the place where he'd done wrong. Crane hadn't started as a villain in his own story. No one did. The world didn't arrange itself into clean categories of who deserved what, and she'd never believed it did. What she believed was that the choices people made accumulated into something, day by day, and that the accumulated thing eventually became the life they were living, and that it wasn't always too late to change the direction of the accumulation. But it was sometimes too late, and knowing which situation you were in required a clarity that most people avoided because it was uncomfortable. She was thinking about this when she realized Jackson was watching her. "Where'd you go?" he said. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered how to say it. "About how I almost didn't write the letter," she said. "The one I sent with your lawyer. I almost wrote something different, something that softened things, said less than the truth." She looked at the pile of documents in front of her. I'd spent my whole life being told that the true version of me was too much or not enough, and there was a part of me that night that wanted to write something that would just get through the door. Something that would make a man I'd never met say yes without having to see me clearly. He was quiet, listening. "But I thought about my father," she said. "He spent his whole life being honest about what he was and what he wasn't. And some people used that against him, and some people couldn't see the value in it. But he always knew exactly who he was. He never had to keep track of a different version." She paused. "I think that's worth something, being the same person in every room, even when it costs you." Jackson looked at her for a long moment. "It didn't cost you here," he said. "No," she said. "It didn't. But I didn't know that when I wrote it." "That's the thing, isn't it?" he said slowly. "You can't know. You just have to do the honest thing and hope the world has room for it. And if it doesn't," she said, "you find out that you can survive that too, which is its own kind of knowledge." He reached across the table, not dramatically, not the way things happened in novels, not with the weight of a declaration. He just set his hand on hers for a moment, briefly, the way people touch things they want to be real. And then he pulled back and picked up his coffee, and she picked up her pen, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the Montana night settled in around the house. The formal proceedings took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Crane's water challenge was dismissed by the land commissioner on the grounds of insufficient survey evidence and conflicting documentation. Arthur Briggs filed the criminal interference complaint with the county sheriff. Calloway filed the civil proceeding. Thomas Hale, quietly and without fanfare, called in 2 smaller notes that Crane's land company held with the Silver Hollow Bank, which was within his rights given certain language in the loan agreements that had apparently always been there and had never before been invoked. Victor Crane did not appear in person for any of it. He sent lawyers who said the things lawyers said and accomplished less than they'd hoped. By the end of the 3rd week, the shape of his losses was clear. The water challenge gone, a criminal proceeding pending that he would spend significant money to defend against and might not win, the bank notes called, and, perhaps most significantly, in a county where reputation was infrastructure, the knowledge spreading through the right conversations in the right rooms of exactly what he'd done and exactly how it had been dismantled. He did not try anything further against the Whitaker Ranch. She heard this from Dorothea Hale, who delivered it with the satisfaction of someone who had placed a large bet on the right outcome and was watching the return come in. They were sitting in the good parlor again. They'd been in the good parlor 3 times in 3 weeks, which was more than Amelia had expected and which represented, she understood, a relationship that was genuinely different from the one that had started in the street outside the general store with Dorothea's careful, surgical kindness. "He's going to pull back," Dorothea said. "He'll hold what he has and he won't move against the ranch again. He can't afford the attention." "He'll wait," Amelia said. "He's a patient man." "He was a patient man with a long plan," Dorothea said. "The plan's finished now. Starting over takes a kind of energy that—" She paused, and something crossed her face that was more personal than her usual careful expression. "That men like that don't often have after a certain age. They invest everything in the one approach. When it fails completely, they don't rebuild. They just hold what they have, and get old. It was the most honest thing Dorothea had said to her, and it arrived in the room with a weight that she thought was about more than Victor Crane. She didn't comment on that. She filed it in her mental ledger and moved on. The North Channel was repaired in the first week of November. Jackson did part of the work himself, which surprised some of the hands and didn't surprise her at all. She'd understood from early on that he was a man who needed to put his hands on things, who found something in physical work that abstract management didn't give him. And the channel was not just infrastructure, but the thing that had been targeted, the place where Crane had tried to cut into the living body of the ranch, and Jackson repairing it himself was the right response to that, even if you couldn't explain it in practical terms. She brought him lunch on the second day of the repair work. She climbed up to where the stone channel ran along the north ridge and sat on a flat rock and watched him work with two of the hands, and he came and sat beside her when he saw the lunch pail, and they ate in the cold, clean air with the view of the ranch spread out below them. "My wife planted those cottonwoods on the drive," he said, without preamble. He was looking down at the long approach road with its young trees. She looked at him. She said a house that didn't have something living at its entrance wasn't serious about being a home, he said. She had opinions about things like that, strong ones. She was right about the trees, Amelia said. Yeah. He ate for a moment in silence. I want you to know that what I had with her was real, and that it's... He paused, working on it. It's not something I'm trying to replace. I don't think you can replace something like that. I don't think that's how it works. No, she said. It's not. But what's here now, he said, is also real. It's a different thing, not a lesser thing. He looked at her directly. I needed to say that clearly, because I don't want you to spend any part of your life in this house thinking you're standing in someone else's place. She thought about the abandoned ledger she'd found in the supply closet on her second day, the one that had stopped mid-page. She thought about the cottonwood trees and the good china and the particular quality of grief she'd recognized in him the first moment she'd seen him on the porch. She thought about her own losses, her own empty rooms, the chair in the corner of the old house that was just a chair now. I know who I am, she said. I don't need a place cleared for me. I make room. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in him did what she'd seen it do only a handful of times. Something settled completely, some deep vigilance that he'd been carrying so long he'd probably stopped noticing it. I know you do, he said. The wedding was not large. They hadn't discussed making it large, and neither of them had moved toward it, which was its own kind of agreement. It was held at the ranch on a Saturday in late November, with Calloway and his wife who'd come from Helena, and the Hales who came with a formality that had genuine warmth underneath it now, and Cody who stood near the back with his hat in his hands and his expression of complete absorption. Mrs. Aldridge made food enough for twice the number present, which was her language for celebration. Hasten shook her hand afterward. It was brief and firm and not elaborate, but it was the handshake of a man who had revised his assessment completely and wasn't going to make a performance of admitting it. She appreciated that. She liked Hasten better now, understood him better. He was a man who'd built his sense of order carefully over many years, and she'd arrived and rearranged things, and the rearranging had turned out to be right, and he was the kind of man who would accept that eventually and not hold the earlier resistance against either of them. That was something. Ruth Caldwell was there with her husband and her 4 children and her oldest boy, who had been working 3 days a week at the ranch since October, and who had turned out to be exactly what Ruth had described, capable and eager, with the focused quality of a boy who understood that an opportunity was an opportunity and intended to use it correctly. He helped serve food and then stood near Cody for the rest of the afternoon, and she watched the two of them talking and thought about what it was worth. Not just the Caldwell arrangement, not just the practical terms, but the thing underneath it, the act of one person looking at another person's situation clearly and deciding that there was something useful and decent to be done. Her father had done that her whole life. She hadn't understood, until she was doing it herself, how much it cost or how natural it became once you started. The months that followed were not a resolution in the way that stories often frame resolution, as a clearing, a settled stillness, an arrival at something complete. Life on the ranch was not like that. The winter brought the problems winter brought, including a stretch in January that killed 14 cattle despite everything they did, and a disagreement with Haston about the spring cattle drive route that went 3 rounds before they landed on something everyone could live with, and a week when Jackson's old shoulder injury flared up badly enough that she had to manage more than usual while trying not to let him see her managing, because he was a man who didn't like to be managed. There were evenings when they sat at the supper table and barely talked, not because anything was wrong, but because two people who have been working hard all day don't always have a lot of conversation left, and she'd had to learn that this was not the same as distance. She'd had to learn several things about living alongside another person that she hadn't known she didn't know. He had too. She could tell by the occasional recalibration, the moments when he caught himself responding to something she'd done with an expectation that came from somewhere else, some old template that didn't fit. They were both, she thought, people who had been shaped by loss into a kind of careful self-sufficiency, and the task of letting that go. Not all the way, not stupidly, but enough to let someone else into the load-bearing parts, was the work that didn't get talked about in the stories of marriages and partnerships. It was slow work, and it was daily work, and there was no document you signed that made it done. You just kept doing it and hoped you were getting better at it. What she knew, by the time the cottonwoods on the drive put out their first real growth in the spring, was this. She had come to a place that everyone had expected to diminish her, and she was larger in it than she'd been anywhere else. Not because the place had made her larger. She'd brought what she had with her, every bit of it, in a traveling bag and a ledger book and an honest letter. But because for the first time in her life, the place had made room for all of what she brought, had not asked her to set any part of it outside the door. She thought about the women who had come before her in situations like hers, the ones who had been handed to strangers for economic reasons, the ones who had been assessed and found wanting before they'd opened their mouths, the ones who had spent their lives being told their value by people who'd decided in advance what it was. Most of them had not had what she'd had, which was the particular stubbornness of a woman who had been her father's daughter, and had kept accounts and had written the truth about herself on a piece of paper and sent it into the world and waited. Luck had been part of it. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. The world was full of women just as capable, just as stubborn, just as unwilling to be less than themselves, who had not landed somewhere with room for what they brought. She thought about them often, and she didn't think about them with the self-congratulation of someone who believed she'd earned her outcome purely through virtue. She thought about them with the knowledge that outcomes and worth were not the same thing, had never been the same thing, and that the difference between where she stood and where they stood was sometimes just the accident of which door you knocked on. What you could control was the letter you wrote, how honestly you described yourself, whether you let someone else's measure of you become the one you walked around inside. Her father had taught her that a ledger was only as good as the accuracy of what you put in it. False entries didn't make the numbers work. They just meant you were working from bad information. She'd spent her whole life trying to be an accurate entry in her own record. Not flattering, not diminished, just accurate. It turned out that accurate in the right place was enough. On a morning in late April, she was at the desk in the study. Her study now, shared, with her ledger on one side and Jackson's cattle records on the other, in the particular organized coexistence they'd worked out, when Cody knocked on the open door. "Morning count's done," he said. "All present, and the North Spring's running full." "Good," she said without looking up. He lingered in the doorway, the way he'd started doing when he had something to say that wasn't the morning count. She'd learned to wait. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "How did you know," he said slowly, "that this would work out, all of it, Crane, the water rights, the whole thing? You always seemed like you knew." "How did you know?" She set her pen down and looked at him. 17 years old, with his focused expression and his honest question, standing in the doorway of a house he'd watched change around him. "I didn't know," she said. "I was afraid most of the time." He blinked. "What I knew was what I had," she said. "The documents, the measurements, the pattern I'd found. I knew those things were real and accurate, and I knew that if I kept putting accurate things on paper and kept showing up in the rooms where decisions were being made, the real things would have a better chance than the false ones." She paused. "That's not the same as knowing it works out. That's just knowing the only thing you can actually control. Cody thought about this with his usual seriousness. My mother says something like that, he said. She says you can't run the race for someone else. You can only run your own lane. Your mother's right, Amelia said. He nodded, satisfied in the way of someone who'd gotten a real answer rather than a reassuring one, which was the only kind of answer she'd ever been able to give. He put his hat back on and went back to work. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Whitaker Ranch was going about its morning. The sounds of it coming through the open window, the voices of the hands, the particular sounds of animals and machinery and ordinary life arranged in the daily order they'd built together. The cottonwoods on the drive were putting out new leaves. The North Spring was running full. Somewhere in the east pasture, Cody was already starting his second count of the morning because he always did a second count when he wasn't sure about a number. And she'd told him once that this habit of checking your own work was one of the most valuable things a person could have. And he'd taken it seriously, the way he took everything seriously. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. April 22nd, 1883. Below it she began the morning entries. Supply levels, pending correspondence, a note about the south fence repair that needed to happen before summer. The ledger, like everything worth keeping, just kept going. Page after page, day after day, one accurate entry at a time. That was how you built something that lasted. Not in a single dramatic moment, not in a single decision or document or act of courage, but in the accumulated weight of all of it together, each ordinary day stacked on the one before it, until what you'd built was real enough to stand on. She wrote until the breakfast bell rang, then closed the ledger and went to meet her life.